Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight is Bucky-inspired comprehensivity to understand and change the world. And Curt has been gracious enough to continue the series. And we've had a series of excellent meetups on design thinking. And tonight we'll be discussing bottom-up and top-down approaches to using Bucky's concepts for a more comprehensive view. So with that, I'll turn it over to Curt.
All right, thank you. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So the title, as you can see, is systems from the top down and from the bottom up. And I don't know, probably this idea originated centuries ago. I'm familiar with it from what's called systems architecture. And in systems architecture, it's one of the heuristics, which is, sort of a recommendation that if you follow it, you're going to do a better job. And the heuristic is essentially that best practice for systems design is to work simultaneously from the top down and from the bottom up. And it occurred to me that this is similar to how Bucky described different perspectives on systems. Okay, let's see what happens. So the first thing is very general. I think from most of you have seen something previously in the series, and I guess if you're new to this series, there are a number of recordings of previous meetups, and we're talking about systems change in general in the most recent of these meetups. And when we talk about changing a system, we start by describing what some people call a situation. And it's a little more general term than saying what is the system we're looking at. And this image sort of illustrates that graphically. This is a situation which looks like three different systems that are kind of overlapping in the middle. And then it's also got larger systems that surround all of those individual systems that are interacting. So this is a simple way for us to imagine that when we're thinking of changing a system, it's because there's some sort of a situation, which typically is systems interacting, if you will. And it's good to remember that when we're looking at things and deciding that we need to describe where we're starting and what we're working on. So if we were to list out the things in the situation, we would potentially list out larger systems. And we'll go into this a little later, show some of the graphics that Bucky did for synergetics. Essentially, those larger systems are slower and they encompass the situation. In this case, they're the two clouds. And so if we had a situation where it was people or organizations interacting, the larger system might be something like the economy, another one might be culture, another one might be nature. So there's always multiple larger interacting systems. And then, of course, we want to list the systems that are interacting. So so let's just say that we've got a situation. Typically, we focus on a situation because we want to improve something, or something is wrong, we want to fix it. In some cases, we want to learn about it. But, once again, this series is on systems change. And so then what could change? Well, there's a number of ways to look at it. So here's a couple of suggestions. Sometimes when we're using a way of looking at systems, a systems lens, they sometimes call it, we're interested in our impact on larger systems. And so things like climate change and environmental, human systems, etc. The one thing we may be looking at is how those systems interact with the situation in the middle, and also how the situation impacts the larger systems. The interacting systems are doing some kind of interaction response, and I'm going to characterize that as behaviors. And we'll go a little bit more into behaviors. So this is, I'm sure, seems like a little abstract at the moment, but we'll get into this further. So I just want to plant this idea in your head that we're going to take a break in a little while, and I'd like to get some idea of things that we might talk about, things that you're interested in. And that's what this question is. It's, well, what is a situation that you're working on or interested in or engaged in? And then in particular, what sort of a thing would you like to change about it? What would you like to change about either the larger systems and the way you interact with the larger systems, or how the systems in the situation are interacting themselves? Part of this is remembering point of view. And somewhere I have a book by Karl Albrecht, Albrecht, and in it he has a statement that's always stuck with me, which is that your point of view determines a system's structure, order, and relation. In other words, the way you look at something changes how you describe it. And a common example is a factory, where a worker might have one particular view of a factory, right? There's a set time to come in, there's work to be completed, there's machines, there's people he's working with or she's working with. And then the manager, of course, is a little bit of a different view, because they're concerned with some sort of metrics, typically, the scheduling, interaction of people, et cetera, et cetera. Then you go to the owner, of course, has a bigger picture of the factory. And then finally, you go to somebody who is going to use something the factory made. And so each of these is different. Some of them are points of view from inside the system, right? And some of them are points of view from outside. But I think in general, we view the challenging situation as something that we could put on a piece of paper like this or model, when in actual fact, almost all the stuff that we're interested in changing, or at least a good portion of it, is actually larger or slower, et cetera, than we're doing it. And so then, once again, let's just keep at the back of our heads, what is the thing we'd like to change and how would we do it? So you're probably saying, okay, this is Mr. McNamara's big picture or top-down view. And it is, and we're going to get to bottom up in a little bit. So I have points in here where it's good to get your feedback. So I'm interested in what people have to say about how systems might change. How does a system change?
Folks, go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom to answer the question as to why systems may change. One thing that I can think of is, oh, okay, Jeannie, go right ahead. followed by Katie.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, that one positive side effect of like demolishing a building or destroying a building is that you can build it up from the um from the basics again. Like East Germany had sometimes more technologically advanced systems than West Germany because a lot of it was rebuilt.
Okay, great.
Go ahead, Jeannie.
One thing that comes to mind is that you can change the way you talk about it. And I'll use as the example the climate change thing, because remember at the beginning it was called the greenhouse effect. And that sounded too positive. That was the problem. Greenhouse, that means everything will grow. So, yeah, let's hurry up and get this going. So, but even, I mean, they fooled around with it. I forget all the intermediate names, but the way you call it makes a big difference in how people perceive it as a good or bad thing. So, same in a way with the abortion issue where, if you call it pro-life, then it seems like you're just a murderer if you would suggest somebody got an abortion. Whereas if you call it, woman's choice, then, it sounds like you're actually in favor of women having some autonomy over their own bodies. So I think the way you name something is very important, or change the name.
Thank you, Jeannie. Next up we have I believe it's Evanique, followed by Stephen.
One thing about how systems change is, new ideas come in and there's a better way of doing something. When something just doesn't seem to be working or working as well as it once did, and then somebody comes in with something new and it works better, new ideas are what changes the system.
Thank you, Evanique. So next up is Stephen. Well, are you able to unmute there? Stephen, you need let me see, ask you to unmute there.
Oh, there we go.
there
All
you
right. Yeah, unintended consequences. You might want to change something and it turns out the system then starts, vibrating off the rails, so to speak. And oh, whoops, I didn't mean for that to happen. I thought it was just a small change.
I'm going to go ahead and add my 2 cents. I think systems will often change as a result of limited resources being used, driving up the price of a particular good. So there are a lot of different examples that I could use with that. But when you could possibly, I don't want to use the word, the example of like something like oil, but that could be one I was thinking about.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So you may remember this from previous talks, that Bucky identified at least 3 different ways for systems change. The one that we're maybe most familiar with is trim tab, right, which is the little rudder on the rudder, and the little rudder, the trim tab, can more easily move the big rudder. So the Queen Mary, which might have a rudder as big as my house, has a few inches of trim tab along the edge. when the trim tab is moved, it creates this low pressure zone that pulls the rudder in a particular direction. And Bucky loved that metaphor for change. And he, his epitaph is "Call me trim tab," because he felt that by his work, he could affect larger things. And essentially, when you think about it, this is a leverage principle, and it's changing the direction or route, or perhaps even the goal of a system. So that's one that probably most people have looked at Bucky are familiar with. The second one, system interaction, was what's happening when a couple of different systems are exchanging things back and forth, which is a result of, the relations between them. And some of the things that you guys mentioned speak to that. And procession is one example of systems interaction. It's also what Bucky sometimes characterized as side effects or unintended consequences, and mentioned more than once that he would set off to go somewhere, but it was actually the side effects of the journey that produced the most interesting results. And once again, this pertains to things you guys have said. And then finally, what I'm going to call system configuration. He's famously said, "Don't fight the existing system, create a new model." And several of you mentioned that as well. So it was great because your answers covered some of this, but also had some different perspectives. So I really appreciate that. Now, if we think about systems change of an individual, we can think about something as easy as this, right? A child learning how to toothbrush, excuse me. And you can imagine that the toothbrushing behavior is something that will wind up embedded in the child, right? It'll be an hopefully automatic behavior, right? And it's subject to some external systems. For example, the parents stressing the importance of it, maybe the belief that they might have to go to the dentist if they don't keep doing it, etc. And so there are these larger systems that overlap and perhaps interact. And then the intended result, I think, from the parents is that the child adapts, hopefully an internal structure that says, "Oh, I want a toothbrush because it's going to keep me healthy," as opposed to one that says, "I'm going to toothbrush because otherwise dad's going to get mad," right? And so this is, I think, a good example of how an actual behavior is really sort of the interaction of all these external larger systems, as well as, kind of the loops and the feedbacks going on in our heads, right? If we go to work and somebody, maybe a coworker says, "Do X, Y, Z," we may resist it a little bit because we're like, "Well, wait a minute, that's a coworker. And, they're not really in position to tell me what to do." And then, of course, if it's a manager, then it'd be a slightly different thing. So the behavior of the individual, in this case, the worker, depends on that external system. So this is just kind of a fundamental thing about systems change that's important to remember, for wanting to change behavior that's inside typically a person or inside of a system. And typically those of us who are examining the system, often we're outside of it. We're not always inside of it. This is a little academic, but hopefully useful. There's a method of describing what happens, and I'm more familiar with it from biomimicry, and it's called structure, behavior, and function. So in terms of what humans do, we want functions, right? So here's this is better. Here's my mechanical pencil. And so if we listed all the functions, we would say, well, the first one is it's going to make a mark, right? It's got to be able to make a mark or it's not a very good pencil. What else? Well, if I take the cap off, oops, this one should have an eraser and it's not there. But that would be a secondary function, is the ability to erase a line. So this function would not be true of the pen that's next to it, right? So the set of functions for this mechanical pencil are such that I can draw something. That's one function, a subfunction, and another one is that I could erase something, so I could change what I'm doing. Whereas with the pen, it's often the function is that the ink not only makes a mark, but it's permanent. Another function of this pencil is that it's got this thing, this little clip, so it would, you know, it would be snugly in my pocket if I wanted to do it. Another function is it has this, I don't know what to call it, but there's a pattern etched into the end of it that makes it easy to grasp and comfortable. Another one is that for the mechanical pencil, instead of sharpening it, you push the end of it, the button on the end, and it advances a little more lead. So anything that humans use has a multiplicity of functions typically. Now, since we want functions typically, if humans do, because they allow us to do things, right? They are typically either they could be metaphysical. A function could be a metaphysical thing, a way of thinking about stuff that lets us be more effective, if you will, or they could be physical. In this case, it's physical. And so if we say that the function in this, once again, is making a mark, then we could say, well, what are the behaviors essentially that could result in that function being accomplished, okay? And then underlying each behavior, there's a structure that permits it to happen. So if we think about the one, which is the mechanical pencil, then the structure looks like the mechanical pencil, and the behavior is, writing and then maybe extending some lead, maybe erasing, etc. If we pick up the pen, obviously it's a different structure, and some behaviors are similar, right? Except there's no erasing part of it, etc. In the case that's shown here, it's a little more general. So let's just say we want to move from point A to point B. That's our function. And then we can say, well, what are our different behaviors that could produce it? Well, we could use a car, we could walk, we could bike, we could take public transport. And then, of course, each of those requires a different structure, a different system. So this is just a reminder that if we're wanting to change a system, typically there is a function, and we may not like the behavior that produces it. We may want to have a different behavior. And the message is that's going to probably require a different structure. And this is kind of like Donella Meadows, ways to intervene in a system, that if we want to change the system behavior, we have to change some aspect of it. Okay, so still on behavior a little bit. And then this is my simple graphic of this interaction between the external systems and what's going on in someone's head as they, decide how to respond to a particular feedback or event or person or whatever. You may remember this. This is student work from when I had a Bucky Fuller class, and I wanted the students to describe themselves as a polyhedral system. And so this is a metaphysical view of us. And so our functions, of course, we have physical functions. We can move, we can eat, right? We can take in air and water, and then we can also create things. And so with the students I taught, typically they were designers, so they're interested in creativity. And so then this is one example of student work where they just said, well, okay, if I was going to describe myself as a polyhedra, here are some of the, these nodes, if you will, where me as a metaphysical system interacts with the world, right? You can think of this as, let's just say you go into work. Work wants something from you, right? Some ability to process information or do some physical labor, to create something. So there's an output that's desired from you. And then in exchange for it, right, you take in certain information that lets you do the job, probably some kind of a paycheck, etc. And so then you can view this as a, essentially a sort of a complex polyhedron, if you will, with a certain amount of outputs that are useful to other systems and a certain number of inputs that, range from things essential to your existence to things that, just help this process go along. So think back now to the situation with interacting systems. Even an individual has a lot of complexity, right? If we look at system models, this is a systems dynamics model, and this one is something about composting and regenerative farming. And it just shows all the different things that go on in an operation, as well as interconnections, for example, CO2 emissions and things going back to the earth. And so then we can make fairly complicated system models of interactions like this. And the result being that we can say, oh, well, there's a behavior of the system that I'd like to change. And then we have to decide, is there something inside the system, right, that we can look at and alter? And once again, if we're outside the system, that can be difficult, right? Because essentially we're wanting something inside the system and we're not part of it, we're wanting something to change. That's a big challenge. So once again, we're still on this top-down view, right, of how to go through and look and think about systems. And I think this is very common for people involved in modeling and systems change and futures to think about. This is one representation of Danola Meadows' ways to intervene in a system. And if we went back to the system dynamics model I just showed you, we could actually look at some of those loops, that produce particular behaviors. And then we could go and look at these strategies and figure out how to apply one or more to come up with a changed system. And remember, she has a whole variety of them. And at the top level is basically reconfigure the system, or the goal of the system, similar to Bucky's creating a new model. And in some, she's just sort of adjusting, a flow or a storage. And now it gets more like the trim tab, changing the operation a little bit. So in terms of how the individual systems interact, Bucky graphically showed this from synergetics. You've got systems that are completely separate, sort of here in the middle left. They aren't interacting at all. In the lower right, you have systems interacting at a single node. And he said, this is kind of like a gas where the molecules are all just flowing around and might have temporary association, but they're not strongly bonded. In the upper right, you see two connections. And he said, well, that's more like a hinge. So it's more like a liquid, or in some cases a metal, where things are flexible and can move around. And then finally in the center, he shows systems that share more than 2 points. And at this, when that happens, then they actually become a larger system. And I like to use this with sustainability presentations, because if you think of the lower right with a single point, that could be an extractive operation. I'm simply pulling the oil out of the ground, or I'm chopping down the trees, and I'm not doing anything to return to the earth. And some, what they call industrial farming, it's the same way, right? We're just extracting stuff from the soil. We're not giving anything back. Then we move to the upper right, where we see that there's two connections. Now we have the potential of regenerative. So now it's farming where we're going to return plant matter to the soil by having a cover crop, or doing other methods like crop rotation that actually help build up the soil humus and minerals and nutrients. So once again, systems change, and now we're looking a little bit lower, right? Because now we're looking at these individual interactions of system elements. It turns out that we can look at, and we will look later on at how Bucky took this all the way down to quantum level, but it also can be done at a very high level. So these tetrahedra, which are the minimum system, could actually represent a very high level system, just a very abstracted view of it. So we can use his insights along the layers, levels of abstraction, or what we call hierarchy. Okay, then just a little bit more. If you've been looking at the series, we've covered this before. Obviously, you can go back. But tuning in, Bucky, said really that's such a key thing from a comprehensive standpoint. And this is Amy Edmondson's Fuller explanation. where you walk in the room and you don't see everything simultaneously because you can't take it in, but you wind up focusing on a chair. And all of a sudden you see the chair, and that's the level you're looking at is the chair. You know, you're not seeing like how the fabric is connected, you know, to the chair body. You're not seeing all the larger stuff around the chair. You know, you're focused for that instant on chair. And so she just emphasizes that that's what he did. And so this is another figure from Synergetics, which is hard to see, but you can find this online at just do R.W. Gray Synergetics, and you'll find this, and both volumes are up there, and there's indexes, there's a figure index, and as well as a topical index. Anyway, so you'll find this, and if you were able to zoom in and look at it, you'd see something that looked a little bit more like this, which is, you know, his recommendation that when we start, we both zoom out to look at larger systems, and we zoom in to look at smaller systems. The larger ones are slower, the smaller ones are faster. And that lucidly relevant, that's the second circle in, is where he's saying, you know, that's what you're looking for. You want to make sure that you're aware that that's the, you know, this point in time and space, basically, right? That's the correct size, the correct elements for what you're trying to do. This was from previous presentation, but it echoes what we talked about before, you know, that often when we do this, we're looking, characterizing a current situation. We might have a behavior we want to change. You know, what is that going to require? Maybe new structure, et cetera, and some examples of different ways to configure things, basically. Okay. And from a paper called Requirements for a Dwelling Advantage, he did a little more practical or detailed version of this. And so what you can see in the kind of the, what is it? Well, there's the micro, which is the very smallest thing. Then there's the human organism there. And then there's the dwelling, which is the double lines right around that. And so when he worked on domes or domestic houses or whatever, emphasizing that, you know, that's what we're looking at. And then he basically had a set of requirements for what does the building do. You know, it protects us from larger, more or less frequent forces, right? It creates this, you know, safe environment inside of it. And so essentially it's like what happens when a cell is created. And then I, in other presentations, have just said, well, you can have these really simple images here that represent this to help you think your way through it. But it's important to remember in this case that the user and the person, the icon here, actually compose part of the boundary. And I didn't show that here, but more of that in a minute. And then you can start to think about the flows in and out, you know, things you guys talked about, constraints, right? Impacts, that sort of thing. Overlapping systems, you want to change one thing, but maybe social cultural is tending to make that difficult. And I'm now jumping or bridging, I guess, to a little bit of the bottom up. If you look at the left side, what I did was in VZOM, virtual Zome, I built this boundary of Zome elements. And it just shows that if we were to think of a system boundary, it's not this nice smooth circle, right? It's kind of messy. It's got different lengths. And what I did just tonight was I said, well, and I should actually show that these polyhedral systems inside the boundary are actually connected to the boundary, and actually in some cases create the boundary. In other cases, they wind up being the ports, excuse me, or the ways that things can come in or come out, right? Like in the cell, there's ports that accept certain things, but not others, and other ports that expel certain things, etc. And on the right side is just a figure from a paper I just ran across, looking at cell geometry and just showing how some of the different shapes can pack. And then it turns out when cell boundaries are created, it can be really simple. These molecules called lipids tend to like to come up next to each other and bond together with, I think it's water-loving ends. I think it's hydrophilic, I think, on the inside, and water hating ends, hydrophobic on the outside, I think. And so that's a thing that kind of just happens when you have those lipids floating in a medium. When they do that and they form a boundary, they create this safer environment inside, right? It's just like that Bucky's image of the dwelling where the occupant was safer, right, from the bigger stuff out there. Everything that happens inside a cell is that once you have things contained in a boundary, so cells don't use fossil fuels, right, to pump things around. Basically, they depend on a lot of interactions that happen via diffusion or molecules coming in contact with each other. So by having this safe environment inside the cell boundary, you're much more likely to get things to come into contact with each other and help you with your processes. So then let's think about, remember I asked you to think about a situation or a challenge or something we started. So I'm going to go back now in a second, on the next slide, and kind of collect your ideas. But what sort of things make up your system boundary? Is it an organization? So part of it is the people. Is it something physical like a house or a building? So I'm kind of interested in, let's see, there we go. Okay, see if I get this. All right. In some situation, and if you're not quite sure where to start, just throw out a situation and we'll work together to come up with things that might create that boundary. So who wants to be brave?
So folks, go ahead, raise your hand in Zoom or type exclamation point in the chat if you would like to share your idea with Curt. And if I'll give everybody about 10 seconds to come up with something, and if not, I believe Jeannie and I believe Stephen, are you raising your hand? That's just an applause you're hitting?
No,
Okay.
no, sorry.
Oh, you're hitting applause.
No.
Oh, you were raising your hand.
There we go. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so why don't we start with Jeannie and Stephen, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I have something, but I think it has been called bunk, so I'm not sure it's really true. But I like the idea of critical mass. So if you get enough people doing something, then things will change. And I don't know, it just seems possible, but some people say that that's a fallacy.
Well, I would disagree. I think it's been proven, so Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, goes into that. And Steve will tell you he made a couple of errors in his explanation, but it's a real thing. It's a version, I think, Jeannie, of what they call emergence, right? Which when you get a certain number of birds together, they can flock, or you have a certain number of ants, or bees or whatever. Those individual behaviors create this higher level behavior that you didn't anticipate. So, yeah.
So go ahead, Stephen. You're up next.
Yeah, I just a comment on Jeannie. Yeah, there appears to be a system boundary with the flocking of starlings, and when in fact none of the starlings consider the edge of the flock to be a boundary. They're just doing their individual behaviors, and collectively it looks like somebody's directing traffic, but nobody is. Kind of along those lines, I was thinking that there can be a physical boundary that just prevents you from getting in and out, much like a cell membrane. But again, along the lines of what Jeannie said with critical mass, what if the boundary was like gravity? It's hard to pull away from gravity, so there's something in the center that's holding you there. not necessarily a boundary on the outside that prevents you from getting away. It's this sort of like an internal force that's holding you there.
Nice.
May I ask, Kirk, is it all right to have boundaries that are artificial? In other words, that like city limits or land that would be a boundary, would that be sufficient? I would say
Sure.
then yeah, yeah, land essentially.
Uh-huh. Right. Yep.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to offer any ideas as far as a boundary is concerned?
Oops.
So, well, I'm not going to go back to presentation mode right away because I'm guessing somebody else out there still has something. And if you want to speak, you can also just type it in the chat.
Yeah, go right.
But I think this whole idea of system boundary and interaction is a huge topic. You know, you remember that picture of, you know, the person looking at this external polyhedral system, right? They're outside of it and they want to change it. Well, how do you do it? Right? I mean, you could try and change the conditions, you know, surrounding it. So, for example, you could convince Congress, you know, to change the laws, which would then, you know, change system behavior. You could do that. But if you're trying to change, you know, the organization itself and you're outside of it, how do you do it? You know, Bucky would say, well, you find the designers and you work with them, you know, in a trim tab fashion, perhaps. You know, but the fact that these boundaries exist, you know, and they'll let certain things in. And like another one I like to use is a company has a physical boundary, right? Typically, I mean, at least used to. I'm talking about old school companies of a building, but that's got doors, right? And so you let certain people in or out, and maybe the doors have screens, and maybe you let air in and out, but not bugs. And then it's got an information boundary, right? Which is, well, we try and keep quiet about what we're doing to people who are in the company, but of course we all go home, and then many of us have partners, so they wind up knowing a certain amount of it. So anyway, the whole boundary thing is very rich, but it looks like Jeannie raised her hand again.
She did. Got it, Jeannie.
Oops. Well, my thought was actually when you run out of something, but I don't like that as a boundary, because then I'm thinking you really want to change the system before you run out.
Yeah, if I may, just follow up on that. You know, I was thinking about it and I said, you know, where sometimes systems change is that there's a rarity of something. So let's just say it's a rare earth metal or something along those lines. And then things become too expensive, and then it hits a point where you actually need to change. So you need to find an alternative. So I think that that's actually what Jeannie has just brought up is a pretty good example of what I was trying to use as an example a little bit earlier. So that's where the change actually is encouraged.
Right. Yeah. And a current one would be, oh my God, there's not enough material for batteries. Although now there's studies that say there actually is. And of course, everybody's working on new and improved batteries that use different materials. Right. So this has been true, you know, for a long time, that we run out of one thing. Right.
And interestingly enough, this is also where it's kind of interesting to see Buggy's concepts coming together, because to some degree, there may be ephemeralization, right? Where you're able to do more or less, so that boundary actually, in that particular instance, gets wider, larger.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's just one example, but there are sometimes these absolute limits that just exist, and then they're forcing people to change.
Right. So if we go back to that SBF, structure, behavior, function, and different ways to accomplish the function. In COVID, we learned that we didn't have to actually go out to get stuff delivered. It
Correct.
turned out we didn't have to actually physically go to work to have work, right? And so this is all, that whole ephemeralization thing. So, okay, well, this is great. Like I said, and feel free to type something in chat. I haven't looked. But I'll go to the next one. We'll go back to presentation mode. So then once again, this is VZone, and it's a little different learning how to do it, but it's not bad. We actually have a couple recordings of Paul Hildebrand, who is the zone guy, explaining how to use it. And so if somebody wants, it's up in the trim tab, a book club shared directory if you want to do that. And it's cool because you don't have to have all the struts. But I was just trying to show, from Bucky's standpoint, that a system, has to be at least tetrahedral, and it's often much more complex, right? And well, actually, this is a good illustration. So if we're starting a system design, we might be thinking of the system on the right, and we want it to do a certain thing. For example, we'll talk about maybe a medical monitor. And we'd say, okay, well, here's a medical monitor. And we might say, well, what are the functions? Well, it's got to monitor this body parameter like blood glucose. It's got to be able to either record, it's got to be able to make a measurement and make a digital representation typically of the thing we're doing, and then typically either store it or transmit it. And we're like, okay, what else does it need? Well, it needs a power supply, something. Well, what does a power supply need? Well, it probably needs a way to be recharged or have batteries replaced. So what we're doing is we're taking this thing on the right, which it's not necessarily going to look like a tetrahedron. It's going to look like, that polyhedral person. It's going to be that big messy thing. And then we're going to say, well, there's a chunk of it, right, that's power supply, and there's a chunk of it that's basically sensor stuff, and there's a chunk of it, right, that's processing, et cetera. And so that's the top-down view. And so a design standpoint, we make that list of functions requirements. And then from the top-down view, we say, well, okay, we have to drill down and figure out all the stuff about a power supply, for example. On the bottom-up view, we might say, well, what are the really essential things? And you might start saying, well, what is that sensor? Is it going to go on the skin, in the skin? Does it transmit via a wire like it used to in the old days? Or is it a little radio kind of a thing nowadays? So we'd look at the smallest, and we might even say, well, looking at the sensor, it's going to be in contact with the skin. Oh, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here, right? And so then starting from the bottom up, we'd be looking at very small little subcomponents, less larger polyhedral system. And then from a design standpoint, if we're doing both things, we've got the big picture top down and we're looking at what we're aware of. We might also say, well, we think it has to have a power supply. And we might start thinking about really, well, there's going to be this kind of a aspect or component in the power supply. So if you do that and build towards the middle, systems architecture, systems engineers would say you're going to have a better chance at capturing everything. But this VZone picture was just to show, that we can have this exchange between a larger system and a smaller system. And once again, this could be the student on the left, the polyhedral model of the student who is engaged with the organization on the right. They've got some ability to produce some kind of a product, and in return for it, right, to get, well, more than just money typically. If your job just gives you money, you're probably not going to be happy for very long, right? It's got to have a certain amount of other aspects in terms of human interaction and et cetera. So it quickly gets very complex. But I think these fundamental ideas are useful. So then, once again, from this bottom up, how far did Bucky go down? Well, he went down to the quantum level. That's pretty bottom up, right? And you might say, well, what's the point of that? I'm not going to ever start a design where I'm thinking at the quantum level, right? I'm going to think of a design or a change to a system maybe at the organism or behavior level. So why would you want to do that, Mr. McNamara? And the answer to a certain extent is on the right side. And so then this shows that if you look at all the components that are in a cell at the very bottom, it turns out that those same kind of components, the boundaries and the ports and the feedbacks, are in a set of cells that are stuck together, right? A multicellular thing. And above that is what Miller, the one who made this picture, called the organelle, which is sort of a subset of your organs, right? So your kidneys and your liver are not made, they're not all uniform with exactly the same stuff. They've got subsystems called organelles. They have boundaries, they have inputs, they have outputs. Same with the organism, or the organ and the organism, the human or the animal, and then organization. And so this is called isomorphy, systems isomorphy. And it simply says that there are a wide variety of stuff. What's true at one level is true at the higher levels and the smaller levels. Of course, some things do change, but if we really have a good sense of these fundamental interactions, remember we talked about how you could have, in essence, here's a tetrahedral quantum event, but you could also, I don't have it in this one, but Bucky has a thing where he has Plato's triad of beauty, truth, and symmetry.
Mhm.
He said, well, it's not a system because it's only three things, but when you add an observer, now it's a tetrahedron, and it makes complete sense because you've got to have an observer to determine beauty, truth, or symmetry, and that beauty has a relation to truth and symmetry, in the same way that symmetry has a relationship to beauty and truth. So learning the basics, this bottom-up stuff, even if we feel we'll never really be modeling this far down, can be very useful. And then back to Jeannie's suggestion, the idea of emergence, right? And so one way of systems change is if people change their behaviors as individuals, eventually that rolls up, right? Like what the Arab Spring or different things, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, right? They weren't top-down events, were they? A lot of people got really upset about something, wanted to make things different, and got together and self-organized. Or the response, like some things about when the hurricanes hit Louisiana and there weren't enough people, from official organizations, folks just figured out how to network themselves and took out their 4x4s and boats and did their own rescues. So there's lots of examples at that level. So this is the bottom-up view. So that's really the point of the presentation, is that Bucky showed us both, right? This top-down comprehensive view, as well as this bottom-up view. And so his tools can be used to enhance designers' work or system change work, etc. And then just a couple of slides just showing you, artist representation of the cell boundary. You see a protein channel there in purple on the left. You see ports, yeah. And then this just reiterates that, inside the boundary, you have this more constrained environment where you're more likely to have molecules bumping into each other and thereby interacting, via diffusion. Whereas outside, you might get a molecule if you're lucky, but once it's inside, you've got a much better chance of interacting with it. And, it reminds us of honeycombs and different ways that Bucky modeled things like the, what we call the vector equilibrium or the cube octahedron, a space-filling structure composed of tetrahedrons and octahedrons. And then, internally, the cell has so many subsystems, just astonishing level of stuff. Just recommend anybody who wants to look and think about, anything as a metaphor for design, to look at the cell. It's got information processing and capture and storage. It's got filtering. It'll accept certain things, reject certain things, responds to certain pathogens in certain ways, can reproduce, right? So it's kind of a model for many, many things at a higher level. And that's similar to what Miller showed us. And there's so many different representations now. It's just wonderful to see them. And there's some that are much more complex than this. Oops, and I had this in here twice, so that's okay. Okay, well, there's a bunch of stuff for you.
Can I ask you a quick
Oh yeah, pretty good.
It was an excellent presentation. I mean, fantastic.
Thank you.
That's a quick question. So how would this be the same thing as macro comprehensive, micro incisive?
Yeah, that sounds good. Macro,
Yeah.
micro. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that in a lot of different ways.
Mhm.
And how that would actually fit into some of the things that we've been actually talking about over the past week with CJ's, or actually the past few weeks with CJ's essays,
Mhm.
specifically. You know, how we looked at some of the things like the political, the economic, the ethical, the cultural, all these other,
Hey.
you know, factors when we were talking about boundaries.
I can't hear
But-
you. Wait.
Oh, well, so as
Just
before I
give me
go,
a sec.
I think what is it? All right. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation point in the chat if anybody has any questions for Curt or any comments, or if actually I don't know if we want to work through some of those models or not.
Sure.
But Ebony, go ahead.
Curt, first I want to say thank you for an excellent presentation. And going back, when you were talking about the slide with the where you were talking about like you can't focus on everything. I really love that because I think a lot of times when we're studying new concepts, it's like we try to get everything in at once and it's almost impossible. But if you can focus on that one thing, and I guess that's what I'm doing right now. It's like I'm focusing on the chair example because you can notice the details of the chair. And if you get that, then you could get the next thing, and then it's the next thing. I think that's the way to approach something that's complicated, like systems, especially, top down, bottom up. Like, how do you, like, you're using the example of Congress, and like, how do you influence Congress? And you're like, you look at the designers, like, who's creating the bills, who's creating the laws, who's just there just to be seen, and who's there to actually make the change. And that's the key. You got to focus on one thing. It's the trim tab thing. So I just wanted to say thank you for that example because that was one of the things that just really stuck out to me.
Great, thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? If not, I can actually I would like to actually just bring up the one slide where you were talking about the function and the behavior. I thought that slide was actually very interesting for a number of reasons. Basically, when we were talking about CJ's essays, this past week, actually, you know, one of the things that we would look at is the cultural aspects of how changes occur. So that's like when you're talking about it from a behavioral standpoint, the cultural beliefs of the system impact the behavior. And any kind of change that you're actually going to introduce is going to have to account for that. So that somehow, like, that's where you can come up with an idea that you might think is you know, a good idea given just looking at it from a bottom-up level, but without considering the reasons, the behaviors that exist in the first place, that the system would actually reject it. So that's actually a really important point and something that I found to be very interesting. Does anybody, Jeannie, please?
Well, there's also the initial inertia of any change. And I think that kind of operates on the large and small level. So you have to start off by, having some kind of, celebration with balloons and flags and so forth. in order to get people's attention to get the change started, or something, something has to happen initially, I think. And I'm not sure how to do that other than the balloons part.
Yeah, there's a rich literature on organizational change and from different perspectives, but you're absolutely right. And often it's hard even for the leadership in an organization to institute a new way of doing things because people are really invested in the old way, right? And you're asking them to do something different, and they're not used to it, and they're unsure about it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there on that. And yeah, absolutely. And so then some sort of a ritual to make a break, right? Some kind of feedback to encourage it. I have a slide I almost dropped in. And so it's got this access of sort of this behavior, if you will, over time. And so then you have this new behavior that you want to implement, right? And so it goes along and then it's going to get more and more and more of it. And finally, of course, at some time it plateaus. Well, for that to work, you've got the old behavior, which is quite high at the beginning, and you've got to find a way to decrease that. And so then it takes sort of two processes. One is to encourage the new, right? And the other one is to sort of not midwife, but whatever it is, transition the old behavior into something.
Excellent. Stephen.
Well, along those lines, you talked about organizational change. Well, in that case, you got to get buy-in, and then the individual elements, the people, are responsible for changing themselves. Whereas in a system like the cell, you can't tell the mitochondria or the ribosome, here, change. You need to change yourself. You're going to have to go in those, how shall I say it, self-directed entities. You're going to have to go in and change them individually to get a systems change. And then you, again, run into the unintended consequences. Maybe the ribosome needs to be changed only 1%, and then that really rattles things around. Whereas if you change that 1% and you change two other things also by 1%, and the whole cell just collapses because there's too much reverberations.
Yeah, I don't understand that stuff really. I read about how often you have to kind of trick a living system, right? You have to sort of, you've got a behavior where something is allowed in, and you've got to sort of like hijack that behavior to basically change it. And so I know things like that happened. It's an active research thing in the medical field, but I don't know much about it. But yeah, I agree. It's once again, outside versus inside. We're obviously outside of ourselves and outside of others, right? And then, the best we can do is interact at the boundary, unless we can do what Jeannie was suggesting, right? Is find a new way of interacting that produces new behaviors. That's Bucky's new model, whatever that is. Him selling his one-piece bathrooms directly to consumers was a new model. The car was a new model. Yeah.
Jeannie, did you have your hand up again or no? So yeah, actually another thing that I think that's really important talking about, and I mean, obviously we brought it up to here this evening, is the trim tab. And the reason why I think that that's so important is that whenever you're going through in trying to make changes to a system, you're kind of looking at it and saying, okay, I want to have a really big impact, but I also want to make sure that I'm having the most impact, the most bang for my buck, so to speak. And so you can list out what your options are. And then it becomes a quantification exercise I think to a certain degree. And that's the boundary. So if somebody says, I have, a goal of growing 5%, okay, then what are you going to do in order to help achieve that goal, but not only, come up with the idea, but come up with the idea that will enable change to happen across the system and have that 5% reached. So an example that I'm just thinking of is that if there is a and I'll go to Mona. Actually, I'll go to Mona before I go to my example. So, because my example is kind of long-winded. Go ahead, Mona.
Hi, sorry I'm gonna keep my camera off for now. I wanted to bring up something that I've heard the other night on the AI meetup about what makes the difference between AI creating art or whatever it creates and a human. It's like what is it that makes for actual creativity to surface as opposed to random, just sheer processing power. And for some reason, I thought about this in the current context we're discussing right now, what makes change. What makes change, to me, it feels like it's something that's unpredictable to a certain extent, even in our behavior. It's like we do things the same way until we don't. And that something comes from somewhere where we don't know, really. And that's when things change because systems don't repeat their process identically all the time, but they just gradually change over time. And over time, that change becomes incremental, and then you can't help but change. But I think that it's all starts with our own unpredictability. Because we are the elements of the system, or parts of the system, and we move things by how we move, and sometimes that it's unpredictable. So that's what I wanted to say, and that's what feels creative to me, and what makes the difference between human and machine.
Nice. Yeah, very early on when Steve and I met, we went through Where Good Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson. And so, he mentions that idea, and it's other people who look at evolution say maybe life creates with mistakes. That's in, I think that's in the Living Life's Principles from Barnard Institute, I'm pretty sure. I think the life pattern people might say organizes with information or something, but it's an extremely good point that a lot of the variety we see came about because of these things that were unexpected. So that's absolutely true. It's still a puzzle, how it works so well. There's new work we've seen that says, well, the way things, go together, right? Bucky would tell you there's only like 92 sort of stable elements, right? 92 ways to arrange electrons, neutrons, and protons. And then you get all this behavior out of the individual ones. And then, of course, if you start combining them, you get things like, basically synergetic or synergistic, if that's the word, behaviors. So there's these fundamental components, but once we start putting them together, right, it's kind of like modules or cells, we can come up with this huge, amazing variety of stuff, right? And yeah, it's not clear how that all will work out with AI. Steve and I also are in a group, an innovation group, where we study what's called structured innovation. And that says, well, there are different ways you can take a situation and change it. And some of those come from a study of all the things people have done in the past, like patents. And that would be TRIZ or trees, theory of inventive problem solving, has what they call 40 inventive principles. And since those exist, you can give those to an AI, and it can generate things based on human rules, right, that are going to be able to produce a wide range of possibilities. Now, are any of those useful? You need the human in the loop, don't you? So I think the interesting stuff is going to be a combination of people, and the machine. And I got actually an older book that talks to that, about how you can use the machine for creativity. It just has to be this, it can't be the machine by itself, essentially. It's got to be, the combination of the human intellect and the artificial one, I guess.
That's a very interesting, oh, go Gene.
I don't know why human beings should be unpredictable. I mean, it seems as though, I mean, we've got these very standardized bodies, and even our nervous system. I mean, it's complex, but you know, we've got the basic stuff that all the other animals have. I mean, in fact, we have really, we're pretty close to plants too. Why would we be unpredictable? And shouldn't AI be able to, figure this out and be able to predict what we humans are going to do?
There's a,
Good.
well, yeah, I don't know specifically, Jeannie. Another recent book called The Handover, the subject of it is, are humans going to continue to hand over responsibility for various things to artificial intelligence? And so the author says, well, probably, because we've been doing it since like the 17th century, when this, I don't know how you say it, Hobbes wrote the book Leviathan. I might have both those words mispronounced, but the idea is that at that point, there was already, quote unquote, a state, right? Organization of people that took over certain things. And we allowed that, right? We want the state to be able to organize juries, figure things out, enact laws. So we've always given away a certain amount of stuff so that we don't have to figure it out as individuals. And then, of course, the same's happened to corporations, and which have acted on their own, and they've also acted on behalf of states. For example, when you develop stuff for World War II, you give the corporations money and say, you've got to go and do a bunch of science and create some useful stuff so we can win this war. Okay, and so then you have what he called artificial agency, which is the state. He said, well, it's messy, it's imprecise, but it consists of people, so it has a human element. And so you'll never get completely abstract, cold-blooded, responses consistently from a state or artificial agency, because it's got people in it. You can get a lot of bad stuff, but over time, you have the human component. And the results will often not be ideal. They'll be messy, imprecise, they'll be subject, right, to all kinds of stuff. You get messy, weird laws and et cetera. That's just the way that the state has worked and will continue to work. Whereas he claims then the AI, if you define things, it'll say, potentially this is the right answer, right? Or this appears to be the best out of these alternatives. And for the thing that may be a risk for us long term is that the AIs don't have any human aspect. They weren't raised up. They haven't interacted with other humans or even other AIs, right, to learn what that's like. And so if we're not careful, if we let the AIs run things, we can get to the sort of inhuman world where it's just based on this logical calculations, as opposed to making sure we keep the, perspective on humans in the loop. So it doesn't really answer your question, but it does kind of overlap part of what you're asking about.
Yeah, you're on mute. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Gene.
I want to, well, as an example, perhaps. So, with teachers, they're trying to find out which is the best way to teach something. And, so they try this, then they try that, and they don't get a real consistent result, because one of the problems is that you need variety. If you always do it the same way, it gets very boring. So, I mean, but we know this about ourselves. We know we need variety. So why not put that in there as something that, is a need, or, as an initial requirement?
Yeah, I agree.
Mona, I don't know if you actually wanted to maybe reply to Jeannie's question as well regarding change, as to why it's not predictable. But if you don't feel obligated to answer that question.
I'm sorry, I don't think I envisioned the question correctly right now. Can you repeat that again?
So basically, Jeannie, you were asking if, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that why isn't change predictable? Like, in other words, why can't we predict the outcomes of change, changes that we're trying to make? Was that
As
pretty much
we as humans? You mean we as humans?
Yes.
Oh, because we're not machines. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. That would be that's so silly of me. I think that even if we do try to stick to rules and plans and everything, even if we have the best ideas in mind that we can do things a certain way and it will work, things will always be different than what we think they're going to be. We're always going to make mistakes. We're always going to fall short. Something will happen. Everything will be different. And then the results are going to be totally different than what we imagine, or not. So we can't tell. That's the point. That's the point. Like sometimes things will work out and sometimes things won't. And it's frustrating as hell. But I think that to I mean, it's so human of us to want to come up with a plan that's fail-proof. It's so human to want that, to have that certainty. But the fact of the matter is we're never gonna get there. That we're gonna be in a place where things will go wrong. And those are the moments of opportunity. Like when we can actually show up to the plate and come up with something new.
I like
Yeah.
that. Go ahead. Go ahead, Curt.
Oh, no, you finish. I just noticed that Katie.
Okay. Yeah, Katie. Let me just build on to that really quickly. Is that with Curt's one slide, the observer example, I think actually really speaks to maybe why we're so unpredictable. Because we're always doing things from our perspective. So there's a limit to actually our ability to predict things in complex systems, because we're it's the observer issue. It's almost becomes like this. We were actually in a conversation about Douglas Hofstadter's example of how we're inability to predict project timelines. And it was something much deeper that he was getting at. And it's more about being into self-referential systems and the idea that there's an inherent bias that exists in us, that we're always overestimating our ability, or sometimes underestimating our ability to accomplish a task. So that kind of leads to the unpredictability. And it goes back to the observer slide that actually Curt was talking about a little bit earlier. So go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, we had that great meetup on unintended consequences. And tying that in with the bee moving the pollen along as kind of an unintended side effect. So I think that's also what's happening, is that you can only plan for what you could plan for.
Perception, right? Is what you're referring to. Katie.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this is one of the more important topics to actually think about, is the idea, because everybody will always ask, what's your theory of change? Oh, Mike, I'm here running my
No, that's fine. What you have to say is probably more important than what I have to say.
no.
There is this guy named Don Rumsfeld who said there's known knowns, there's known unknowns, and there's unknown unknowns. And you build a system, whether it's a building or an artificial intelligence engine like ChatGPT-4 or going on ChatGPT-7. There are probably literally tens of millions, thousands of millions, billions of lines of code, or billions of components in there. And we know how each one of them works. We have a transfer function definition, and we know exactly how each one works. But it's sort of like the weather. A butterfly flying in New York can create a tornado in Oklahoma. And that's an emergent property, chaotic information. You know that causality really works, but it's not possible with the data we've recorded and the compute power we have to know how it works at that level. So we end up with most experiments not being repeatable. You give one person COVID vaccine, and that person gets on a bus where 3 days later before somebody had COVID and was on the bus, and that person comes up with COVID, and another person gets sneezed on, coughed on, or thrown up on by a person who's dying of COVID and doesn't get COVID. So that's an example of chaotic behavior, and not really repeatedly done. Now, the brilliance and the creativity comes up in some CNN reporter saying he knows how that happened or she knows how that happened. That's creativity. But the rest of us mortals aren't that creative. So I yield the balance of my time.
I'll go back. Thanks, Mike. That's great. And I did read that as well, that, you know, they turned on these big LLMs, large language models, like the ChatGPT, and they found that they could do things that they'd never been trained on. So they were showing this emergent behavior. And I think we'll just see more and more of that. It's just, you know, you have so many interacting elements, it's just going to happen. And to go back to, I think both Mona and Katie and Joe's comments, another recent book I read, Uncertain, was just, you know, saying that often if we're uncertain about something, we're open to more possibilities and we'll do better. One of the examples was coming out of COVID, or I shouldn't say that, coming into the pandemic, certain companies said, well, we know right what to do. We're just going to keep doing this kind of a thing and just executing on it. And they tended not to do very well. Compared to the companies that said, boy, oh boy, everything's different here. We've got to be open and exploring and trying different possibilities. They tended to do much better. And so she goes over and over situations like that. There's stuff about kids and learning, you know, moms who've had a really challenging life, right, and are interacting poorly with kids, and teaching them to just pause for a moment before they have that reflexive response and think about it, and just be able to then say, well, wait a minute, you know what? You know, I know my son has these issues and this is just a thing he's going to keep doing. And so I can choose a different way. And how even just a little time doing it, checking back in months or years later, a number of the moms still had that, like they had, and the book is full of good examples like that. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in this discussion.
Yeah, Jeannie.
Well, I was thinking about, you know, that reminded me, you know, doing the practice ahead of time helps us make the change later on. So, you know, people are saying, oh, well, why bother recycle? Because it's all just going in the dump at this point anyway. And, you know, but if everybody learns to recycle, then when the thing really is working, will be you know, will be adjusted to it by then, which will be helpful.
Yes, and in the Wayback Machine, I think the 1970s, Theodore Roszak, Roszak, I think, created a book called Ecopsychology, and what they were able to demonstrate with a number of scientific studies was if you do those sorts of activities, it encourages you to keep engaged and keep a more positive view. Whereas if you don't, then you tend to go towards that, well, we're all screwed anyway, right, with climate change, so why bother, right? Well, clearly that's not going to help, us or the planet or our organizations, right? And so then, yes, just doing those things has these unintended side effects that can be positive. So, yeah.
Well, that sounds like that little micro behavior you're saying builds on itself. Well, that little micro behavior is a human trim tab.
There you
Right.
go.
Very good.
Well, I should probably sign off just because,
Yeah.
I only have so much bandwidth. I want to, though, shout out to Steve because he was the one who gave me the reframing, of bottom up. And I was able to then sort of say, well, wait a minute, that's really what Bucky gave us, right? Is bottom up and top down, which
Right.
I think is going to be very useful for people learning about all of this stuff. So just wanted to thank Steve publicly for that. It's very useful. And I'm actually eventually going to get it where people are going to understand it. But you're very patient to sit through this, initial talk. So thank
This
you.
was fantastic, Kurt. I enjoyed every minute of it. I love thinking about change and how it occurs. It's one of my favorite topics. And so I feel we're extremely grateful that took the time to share this idea with us. So, and hopefully, we can keep going back over it because I think that this is actually one of the more dynamic topics that we've covered in the sense that how change occurs, and that's something that we can keep coming back to with different ideas. And I really like maybe even hopefully if you at some point we could actually just go ahead and work through a problem in one of these sessions. That would be pretty cool. And pick something out beforehand. Maybe we just put I don't know, put an email out or something with some ideas and then work through a problem. I think that would be great. Because I mean, even one of the topics that this really relates to that CJ really hit hard with the design way was judgment. And, how do we make these judgments and how do we kind of reassess what we're doing in order to, once we're engaged in making a change. So that was like one of, he covered that very, very in great detail, but this is all interrelated anyway. But anyway, well, thank you, everyone. And this upcoming week, we have a lot of meetings coming up. I know that there's the Poetry Mondays, the Dow on Tuesday, neuroscience on Wednesday. Thursday is there's a new art series, and then Carl Jung will be covering on Friday. So what has Carl Jung done for you? And then we'll do it all over again the following week. So thank you, everyone. It was great seeing everyone. I appreciate everybody's time. And Kurt, thank you once again. And Stephen, thank you for the idea. So
Thank you. Thank you.
everybody have a
Night,
great evening or
everyone.
a great week.
Thank
Take
you for
care.
hosting, Joe.
No problem. Thank you,
Yeah,
Ebony.
for
Thanks
sure.
for coming.
Yeah.